Hello again, this is Alister McGrath, helping you to get the most out of my textbook Christian Theology and Introduction. We now come to its 6th chapter, which looks at the sources of Christian theology. Where does Christian theology get its ideas from? How does it check them out? Christian theology is usually regarded as drawing on 3 main sources: the Bible, tradition, and reason. And this chapter explores what each of these means and how they're used in Christian theology. For example, are they sources of equal value and importance, and how do they interact with each other? The first source we look at in this chapter is the Bible. And this is a very important resource, and we look at a number of questions about how we use the Bible in theology, including the question of how the canon of Scripture was fixed in the first place, and the central notion of how we interpret the Bible. If theology is grounded in the Bible, then several questions emerge from this. Why the Bible rather than some other texts? What is authoritative about this text and not others? This is very often discussed in terms of the inspiration of Scripture. But perhaps most discussion focuses on this question: how is the Bible to be interpreted? And many historians suggest that actually the history of Christian theology is really the history of biblical interpretation. So after dealing with the Bible, we move on to the second source of theology, which is tradition. This idea plays a really important role in most forms of Christian theology. It's all about how the theological past feeds into the theological present. In what way are today's theological debates shaped and informed by historic theological debates? In what way, for example, is the contemporary interpretation of Scripture determined by its historic interpretations? And there are 3 broad approaches to this question of tradition which we look at in this chapter. We then turn to consider the role of reason in theology. And again, there are a number of understandings of the rational basis of theology which we look at. And particularly important here is a movement known as Deism, which emerged in England during the late 17th century. And this section of the chapter picks up on some of the themes arising from the Enlightenment, which we considered in more detail in chapter 4. Then we look at a 4th source of theology, which some but not all Christian theologians regard as being important, namely experience. For some theologians, experience is a very important source of theology, whereas others argue that experience is something that is interpreted by theology rather than itself being a source of theology. Nevertheless, the interaction of theology and experience is really important, in that forms of theology that are not able to relate to experience are often seen as being existentially inadequate. So that was a very brief overview of this chapter. So let's look at it in more detail. The first major section deals with the Christian Bible, often referred to as Scripture. In fact, the words Bible and Scripture are virtually interchangeable in Christian theology. Both designate the body of texts that are recognized as having authority for Christian thinking. The unusual word Bible needs explanation. Like so many words in modern English, it derives from a Greek original, and the Greek phrase that's been rendered into English here is ta biblia, literally the books. The phrase ta biblia refers to the collection of writings regarded as authoritative by Christians. Now, Christians use the phrase Old Testament to refer to those books of the Christian Bible which were, and still are, held as sacred by Jews to this day and called by them the Hebrew Bible. For Christians, however, the Old Testament sets the scene for the coming of Jesus of Nazareth, who brings its leading themes and figures and institutions to fulfillment. And early Christians, including Jesus himself and many of the writers of the New Testament, simply used the word Scripture or writing to refer to what is now known as the Old Testament. Then we come to the New Testament, which consists of 27 books. It's a lot shorter than the Old Testament, and it's written entirely in a late form of Greek, widely spoken in the Eastern Mediterranean world of that time. It's often referred to as koine, from the Greek word for common or everyday. And the New Testament opens with the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is followed by an account of the expansion of Christianity in the Acts of the Apostles, more usually referred to simply as Acts. The next major section of material in the New Testament consists of the letters, sometimes referred to as epistles. And these letters provide teaching concerning the Christian faith, as well as reflection on Christian behaviour. And they're an important witness to the emerging doctrinal consensus about the identity and significance of Jesus Christ for Christians. Most of these letters are written by Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, whose conversion to the Christian faith led him to undertake a major program of evangelism and church planting. But there are other letters, for example, those attributed to the apostles Peter and John. And these letters include doctrinal teaching along with moral guidance and spiritual encouragement. And the term pastoral letters or pastoral epistles is sometimes used to refer to two letters Paul addressed to Timothy and his letter to Titus, which deal particularly with issues of pastoral importance. Then the New Testament ends with the book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse, which offers a vision of the end of history, culminating in a glimpse of the New Jerusalem. So how do the Old and New Testaments relate to each other? The Christian terms Old Testament and New Testament are actually strongly theological in their natures. These are specifically Christian terms which rest on the belief that the contents of the Old Testament belong to a period of God's dealings with the world which has in some way been superseded or fulfilled by the coming of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. For Christians, both testaments express the same faith, even if they do this in rather different ways. So the Christian theological framework that leads to this distinction between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, is that of covenants or dispensations. The basic Christian belief is that the coming of Christ inaugurates something new, while still being continuous with God's earlier actions in history. And Augustine of Hippo expresses this in a famous maxim that's worth noting here. The Old Testament lies hidden in the Old, and the Old Testament is unveiled in the New. Now, in the first chapter, we noted that one of the achievements of the patristic age was the gradual achievement of a consensus over what the term Scripture designated. And a widespread consensus appears to have emerged within the Christian churches by the middle of the 4th century over the core elements of the canon of the New Testament, with lingering disputes over 4 letters, 2 Peter, 2 and 3 John, and Jude, which were seen as borderline cases by some church leaders and communities. So how then is the Bible to be interpreted? And this important question is considered in detail in this chapter, which explores a range of approaches to biblical interpretation, for example, literal, historical, typological, and allegorical. If you haven't considered this question before, you'll find this material really interesting. I think you'll find it helpful in sorting out what you yourself think. The key question very often is how to get beneath the surface meaning of the biblical text and discover its deeper significance. Let me briefly look at typological interpretation. This sees Old Testament institutions or events or figures as types. The Greek word typos means really an anticipation or a shadow. So Old Testament institutions are types of Christ and the gospel. Christ is the fulfillment of these types. The Exodus from Egypt, for example, is a type, an anticipation of the salvation that is offered by Christ. And yes, they were important in their own day, but they've now been fulfilled and hence displaced by Christ. Now, obviously, there's a lot more that we need to say about the Bible as a source for Christian theology, and you will find lots of material in the textbook. But we need to move on to look at the second source that theology draws upon, namely tradition. Now, this word tradition comes from the Latin word traditio, which means handing over, or maybe handing down, or maybe handing on. It's all about a process of handing over of something that's important as a deposit of faith, or, for example, the gospel itself. And this idea of tradition is found in the New Testament. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks to his readers about handing on to them what had been handed on to him. Others handed on the core teachings of the Christian faith to him. He is now doing the same. And tradition can here refer to both the action of passing on these teachings and also to what is passed on. In other words, the word tradition can mean both a process of transmission and the body of teaching that's transmitted in this way. So why is tradition important? Well, I think the Gnostic debates of the 2nd century highlighted the importance of tradition as a theological resource. And Irenaeus of Lyons argued that the Gnostics interpreted the Bible in a way that bore no relation to the way Christians read it. They kind of read into it their own ideas. And Irenaeus' argument is very important. The church has been entrusted with both the biblical texts themselves and a certain way of reading and understanding these texts. And so for Irenaeus, tradition is a safeguard against the misrepresentation of biblical texts on the part of the Gnostics. It ensured faithfulness to the original apostolic teaching. The apostles wrote the New Testament, and the apostles passed on through the church how those writings are to be interpreted. And this point was developed further in the 5th century by Vincent of Lérins, who was concerned that certain doctrinal innovations were being introduced without good reason or without proper scrutiny. And Vincent was especially worried by some of Augustine's ideas about predestination, which Vincent felt really were innovations. He argued there was a need to have public theological standards by which doctrines could be judged. For Vincent, the standards were basically tradition. Tradition is about what has been received, and anything that is innovative is to be regarded with suspicion. So what kinds of approaches to tradition do we find in Christian theology? I think there are 3 broad approaches. To begin with, some theologians reject any role for tradition in Christian theology. And we find this approach, for example, in some Anabaptist theologians of the 16th century. You forget the past. The past, if you like, is contaminated or useless. You begin all over again. Yet in most forms of Christian theology, the idea of tradition is affirmed, but is interpreted in 2 rather different ways. So let's look at these. First of all, there's what's called a single source theory of tradition. Theology is based on scripture, but tradition refers to a traditional way of interpreting scripture. Now, we saw a moment ago Irenaeus of Lyons saw tradition as an authorized or appropriate way of interpreting scripture within the context of the historical continuity of the Christian church. So tradition here means basically a traditional way of interpreting scripture passed on within the community of faith. Tradition is grounded in scripture. It's a particular way of reading scripture, so it's a single source theory of tradition. And this is typical of many mainline theologians, including, for example, most Protestant theologians of the 16th century, including both Luther and Calvin. But then there is a two-source, a double-source theory of tradition, where tradition is understood as a separate source of revelation in addition to Scripture. In other words, it's not so much a traditional reading of Scripture, it is something independent of Scripture that is passed down within the church. Tradition is here seen as a stream of unwritten teachings which are going back to the apostles themselves, passed down inside the church. So theology is based on 2 distinct sources, Scripture and unwritten tradition. And we find this approach affirmed very strongly in the Council of Trent in the 1540s, which argued that Protestantism, by neglecting this understanding of tradition, had in effect defaulted from the theological consensus. Now, there's a lot more needs to be said about this source of Christian theology, and you'll find a lot of material about this in the chapter. So let's move on to the third source of theology, namely reason. Christian theologians regard their faith as intellectually warranted or rational for many reasons, perhaps most notably because of the coherent account of reality that it offers. And a very good example of a Christian theologian to take this view is C.S. Lewis, who abandoned his earlier rationalist atheism on account of the more satisfying vision of reality he encountered in Christianity. And Lewis's views on the rational foundations of his faith are summarized in this rather nice sentence, which is now inscribed on this memorial stone in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey in London. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So Lewis affirms the role of reason, and it raises the question of what other kind of approaches do we find? Let me just note a few. First of all, there's a view that Christian theology is fundamentally a rational discipline. And we find this in writers like Thomas Aquinas, who basically argue that Christianity is fundamentally rational and thus can be supported and explored by reason, even if the Christian theology ultimately goes beyond what reason can demonstrate. In other words, it's grounded on reason, but it's not limited to reason. And Aquinas' 5 ways, those very famous 5 arguments for the existence of God, which we're going to look at in chapter 8, express his belief that reason is capable of lending support to the ideas of faith. This does not mean, I must emphasize this point, that Christianity is limited to what can be determined by reason. It's the idea that the basics of Christianity are thoroughly reasonable, but that part of Christianity goes beyond what reason on its own is able to deliver. That's a very important point. But a second approach, which we find, for example, in English Deism during the 17th century, is basically that theology is simply the republication of the insights of reason. It's just saying again, but in a slightly different way, what human reason tells us. And for example, in Herbert of Charbury's very famous 1624 work on the truth of religion, we find this basic idea that Christianity is fundamentally simply a rational form of religion and nothing more than that. It cannot go beyond what reason can say, because there is nothing beyond what reason can say. Now again, much more needs to be said, but let's look briefly at a fourth source of theology: experience. And let's look at the Harvard psychologist William James, who in 1902 published his very famous work, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And James stressed the importance of the subjective aspects of religion in general and Christianity in particular. And while many theologians emphasize the importance of experience, there is disagreement on whether experience is a universal notion, or whether it's shaped by cultural or theoretical, including theological, beliefs. And this chapter gives you a good overview of this debate. I think you'll find it very, very interesting. C.S. Lewis is a very good example of a theologian who focuses on the theological significance of experience. And I use him in this chapter as a case study to help you consider this aspect of theological method. So there's a lot covered in this chapter. And again, the idea is I explain to you what's been thought and in effect invite you to work out what you think. It's very important I stand to one side and let you engage with this material and make up your own mind. Now, I hope to speak to you again soon when we move on to the next chapter, looking about the knowledge of God through nature and revelation, which is a fascinating topic. And I look forward to introducing it very shortly when we consider the 7th chapter of Christian Theology and Introduction. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.